The Tag on the Key. Book 1, The Plan. Chapter 5, The Old Days. My father grew up in Warsaw, the son of a long line of bakers. He was a hard worker, loved sports and music, but in his own words, was not much for school. My grandfather, in addition to being a baker, was a Balt Tefillah, who led the prayers in the synagogue, or the shul as it was called. The Polish hatred of the Jews was a tradition long held. It persisted in Poland for centuries, and despite current efforts to deny this, it continues right up to this very day. My father would deliver bread to the customers in the evening. The Polish boys would routinely try to shake him down for the money he collected. Once there was a Polish boy who threatened my father and demanded that he hand over the money. My father punched the Polish boy hard in the jaw and broke his teeth. Later on, the parents of the boy came to my grandfather's house, demanding payment for dental bills. Obviously, my grandfather refused. It happened that 2 weeks later, my father woke up in a back alley. He had a large bump on the back of his head. Warsaw was the center of the Jewish world at the time. All the holidays were observed publicly, and there were thriving Jewish institutions such as synagogues and yeshivas. Jewish scholarship was at a very high level. My father told me that on Friday nights, there were crowds outside of many houses in which the rabbis would speak. Many people would gather inside these houses and listen to the rabbis as they would expound upon subjects of Torah law and scholarship. As the people inside listened, crowds would stand outside for hours, hoping to hear whatever they could. My father told me that once he listened to a rabbi in one of the houses, and he was absolutely spellbound. It was so many years afterward, but he did remember something that he heard there, and he shared it with me. My father heard the rabbi give an explanation on the meaning of the Hebrew word mazal. The word is often translated into English to mean luck, as in a mazal tov, or good luck. The word mazal is made up of 3 letters, mem, zayin, and lamed. Each of these letters in turn stands for a specific word. These 3 letters stand for makom, which means place, zeman, which means time, and lomdus, which means scholarship. So, the meaning of the word mazal, the rabbi concluded, is that mazal, or luck, is comprised of these 3 aspects and is dependent upon them. If a person is in the right place and it is the right time and he applies his scholarship, in other words, he remembers what he has learned and applies his learning to the situation at hand, then he will be lucky. My father told me that he thought that this rabbi was the smartest man in the world. The rabbi just kept on speaking for hours. He had enlightening words on all manner of topics. This was the only teaching of this rabbi that my father shared with me. And sadly, he didn't even tell me the name of the rabbi. He told me of the incredible respect that the people gave the rabbis. As previously mentioned, there were large crowds outside of the houses or the synagogues where the rabbis would speak. The street was so packed with people that it was impossible for anyone to move. However, when the rabbi left the house, the crowd split before him like the Red Sea, leaving him a clear path to walk. There was also opera and the Jewish theater. Do you recall the play A Fiddler on the Roof? It was originally a Yiddish show that played in Warsaw Jewish theater. Many entertainers would come to Warsaw, and there were street circuses as well. Once my father told me about a man who called himself the Second Samson, who would do feats of strength for the people in the street. He told me that once he saw that man restrain 2 horses while they pulled in opposite directions. There was an Eruv around Warsaw. The Eruv can be described as an agreement between people, or a legal instrument, where under Jewish religious law, it becomes possible to mix private and public domains into a common domain. This, in effect, turns much of the public domain into a private domain. That can be quite useful when it comes to the observance of the Jewish Sabbath. On the Sabbath, Jews are forbidden to carry anything out of a private domain and into a public domain, and vice versa. For example, one is forbidden to carry anything out of his house into the street, and from there to his friend's house. By means of the Eruv, the Sabbath-observing Jew is able to legally carry between domains. Part of the Sabbath observance is the prohibition against cooking. However, it is considered a good deed to eat hot food in honor of the Sabbath. In order to do this, it must be fully or mostly cooked and left on a fire prior to the commencement of the Sabbath. It was not commonplace for people to have ovens in their houses in those days. My father's bakery, needless to say, did have an oven, and it was a large one. So, people would rent space in my father's oven and keep their pots of cholent, which is a special stew made in honor of the Sabbath. They would keep it in his oven for the daytime meal. They would bring their cholent pot before the beginning of the Sabbath, and they would affix to this pot a paper name tag. After morning prayers, they would stop by the bakery and bring home their hot pot of cholent. Many people had the same type of pot, and often the name tags would be illegible due to the heat in the oven. My father told me that there would be disputes every Sabbath as householders tried to find their pot and the name was no longer visible. They would look into a pot they thought looked like theirs. If the contents of the pot appeared to be very tasty, people would naturally think that this was theirs and start taking it home. The resulting fights were legendary. Chapter 6, Fatherly Ethics. My father told me a story about my grandfather Mordechai. It took place when my grandfather was very sick and was lying in bed. My father was asked to go get his uncle Avraham, who was my grandfather Mordechai's brother-in-law, and with whom my grandfather had not been on speaking terms for many years. When Uncle Avraham arrived, my grandfather made peace with him. And after the uncle left the house, my grandfather got out of bed, kissed the mezuzahs, which are the sacred parchments that are affixed to the doorposts in a Jewish house. Then he got back into bed, closed his eyes, and died. My father used to say, the worst peace is better than the best war. My father used to say that in business, you need to watch every penny. But when the time for spending comes, open your wallet and don't be afraid to spend the money. He was fond of the quotation of the sage Hillel, who said, "If I am not for myself, who will be for me?" My father was also fond of quoting King Solomon in Proverbs, who said, "From all of my teachers I grew enlightened." He used to say from time to time, "Life is short, so don't be a schmuck." Once my father invited all of his bakers, most of whom were not Jewish, to dinner in our house. As they were seated around the table, enjoying the meal, he said, "As for me, I'm glad. I was lucky to go to the concentration camp. I have a friend who ran away to the Russians, and he wound up in Ukraine. He really suffered." On one such occasion, he told his non-Jewish bakers in my presence, "If I only had the strength at the end of the war and a machine gun, I would have killed all of my oppressors." The main thing that I remember him saying is, "Es ist gut zu sein Aid." In English, that means, it is good to be a Jew. Chapter 7, Early School Years. School had its ups and downs for me. I learned to read at an early age and really enjoyed it. I spent a lot of time reading and did pretty well in school. I couldn't see the blackboard much of the time, but I was always able to keep up and do well without any real effort. I actually liked the extra questions on the tests because I found them to be challenging and it was a welcome change. I was interested in everything. Sports were difficult for me, especially ball games. I was always the last one to be picked for a team. I couldn't see the ball coming until it was too late. Nobody wanted me on their team. I remember that once there was a girl who was a team captain. When she realized that she was going to have me on her team, she started to scream about how every team that I was on lost and she didn't want me on her team. I felt really bad about it, and I didn't want the others to see that I was going to cry. So I started to walk away as if nothing happened. My friends on the other team told the girl that they would trade someone else for me, and I was called back to join their team. I recently heard that girl's name mentioned after so many years, and it still hurt. There was a boy on the playground at our school who went around calling people dirty Jews. I told him that I was Jewish and that I was proud of it, and that if he did not stop, there would be a fight after school. He clobbered me. I was so ashamed. I went home crying. I was, nonetheless, ready to get clobbered again the next day as well. This time, however, my friends, one of whom happened to be of Arab descent, came to my rescue. I would be in 2 or 3 fights a year with Jew haters, with a varying degree of success. I won a few, I lost a few. To me, it didn't really matter if I won or lost the fight. The main thing was to show them that I was proud to be Jewish. Although I was happy to win the fight sometimes, it didn't hurt so much to be beaten up for being Jewish. It was a way of proving myself worthy of being in my family. Jewish kids often went to Hebrew school in the afternoon after public school let out. Most of us really hated it. I was no exception. However, in addition to the demands on my time, I was extremely unfond of the rabbi. Believe me, the feelings were mutual. I don't know what it was about him, but we never got along. I was quite determined at that point to have nothing to do with the Jewish religion or any other religion for that matter. I was, however, still fiercely proud to be Jewish. My mother let me know that we were a family of heroes. I was the son of heroes. They stood up to the Nazis. They stood up in Warsaw and they stood up in the camps. I could always hold my head up high because of that. Chapter 8, New York. While we were still fairly young, I'd say that I was 8 years old, my mother took my sister and I to New York City. We planned to see the sights, ferry boat ride, Statue of Liberty, the United Nations, etc. While we were in the city, we stayed at the apartment of my Uncle Isaac and Aunt Alice, which was located in the borough of Queens. On our way back to the apartment at the end of the day, we went into a subway station, and an old lady fell on the stairs. She smashed the back of her head pretty hard. It was bleeding profusely. The poor old lady could not move. It was like she was dying, to me anyway. In the meantime, the blood came gushing out of the back of her head, and there was a small puddle of blood on the steps. I remember my mother taking a white handkerchief from her purse to stop the bleeding. It didn't stay white for long. I can still see it. My mother had a special tone of voice that conveyed the meaning of, "This is the way it is going to be." That voice was now informing me that we were going to stay there until there was an acceptable resolution, on my mother's terms, of course. She told me quite clearly that we were going to stay right there until a doctor or ambulance arrived to take care of our old lady. I still remember my mother asking people to call an ambulance or a doctor, and the people just walked by. No one was willing to stop. Finally, my mother got the attention of a janitor, who somehow got someone to call an ambulance. The lady thanked my mother with a weak voice as she was being carried on a stretcher to the ambulance. And we went on to the apartment of Uncle Isaac. He screamed at my mother for coming so late. He said that you never know what could happen in the city, and that it was very irresponsible. I guess he was scared. Say what you will. The ferry, the statue, and the UN building are all faded memories. But my mother's character, now that was a sight to see. I did not find it difficult to believe that she was indeed a true hero.